Hello and welcome to my 9.2 Frost Mage guide. You can skip to whatever section you'd like to on the timeline below. It's probably going to be a really long video because there's quite a few different builds that are being played by Frost Mages right now and I want to explain them all. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy. Leave a comment down below. And then to start, we're going to be talking about the basics for Frost Mage. The most basic thing you'll need to know is Shatter. That's kind of the main mechanic for Frost Mage. It gives your spells an increased crit chance against frozen targets. You can see the formula there, and I'll explain it in a second. That's what's going to cause your main procs to function, so you're going to want to understand what that is. But the way it works is 1.5 times your crit chance plus 50%. To give you an example, if you have 20% crit, you multiply 1.5 by that, that's 30% crit. You add 50% crit to that, and it's 80% crit. So if you just, in your character, have a 20% crit chance, when you're hitting a frozen target, you're going to have an 80% crit chance. So your procs, your frozen ice lance, that's going to have an 80% crit chance. So that's how you understand Shatter. We'll get more into this in the gear section, but that's why there's something referred to as the crit soft cap for Frost, and that's going to be when against frozen targets, your spells have a 100% chance to crit, and that is 33.34% crit. That's not a goal to hit, but it is just a point where crit to mesh is heavily in value. Like I mentioned earlier, Frost has two main procs. The one on the side is Fingers of Frost. It makes your next Ice Lance treat the target as if it's frozen. So you can see it crit, did a lot of damage because Ice Lance does triple damage against frozen targets. And then you have Flurry. What this does is it puts a debuff on your target, which just makes them take damage as if they're frozen. So them taking damage as if they're frozen is the same thing as the side proc, basically. For the default, you're just going to want to use Ice Lance against those frozen targets. Here I just wanted to draw your attention to how Flurry functions. It's 3 projectiles, each one applying the debuff that causes your next 2 spells to have increased crit chance because they're shattering. So that's why you're going to always Frostbolt into Flurry, because your Frostbolt travels slower than Flurry, so it'll hit between the second and third one and just get increased crit chance at no cost to you. Getting into some of Frost's other important spells, you have Frozen Orb. This just does AoE damage to targets and it shoots out from you, and the first time it hits a target, it's going to give you a Fingers of Frost proc. You can see, hit the target, give me a Fingers of Frost proc. Any farther Fingers of Frost procs after that one, so this is RNG. It just happens when it deals damage to the target, has a chance to give me a Fingers of Frost proc. This Frozen Orb actually has a minimum distance traveled, so you do want to stay about like 5 to 7 yards away from where you want it to go, and it will stop when it first hits an enemy. So yeah, you're going to want to use this on cooldown, both in AoE and in single target. Not that you're limited to using it at range, you can still use it from very far away. It just takes longer to hit the target and longer to give you its Fingers of Frost proc. Following that, you have another really important spell for Frost, which is Blizzard. This is going to be your AoE spell. I'll mention what target counts you cast that at during the Legendaries section, because it does change depending on the Legendary you have, but this reduces the cooldown of Frozen Orb every 0.25 seconds each time it deals damage to an enemy. So the more targets that your Blizzard is hitting, the lower or the faster your Frozen Orb is going to come back off cooldown. Another really important spell to mention for Frost is Rune of Power. This is going to be a default talent pick for you, so you're generally always going to want to be using it, and it just increases your spell damage by 40% when you stand within 8 yards. The way to get Rune of Power is you either cast it, like this, or you get one when you drop your Icy Veins, which is your main cooldown. So here, you can see this. They do not stack, by the way, so you don't want to cast them on top of each other. And this has a very yard range. You can see even this far away, I'm still in my Rune of Power. This is just a 40% spell damage power buff. So as soon as that one fades, you just want to cast your other one, because you do want to be casting your Rune of Power on cooldown. So when you enter a situation like what I'm in here with my Flurry on the top and my Fingers of Frost on the bottom, you generally want to make sure you use Fingers of Frost before you use Flurry, because the debuff that this puts on your target does the same thing that your side proc does. It just makes your Ice Lance deal damage as if the target was frozen. So if you use your side proc into a debuff on the target, it's not going to do anything extra. It will just be wasting a proc. And this is commonly referred to as proc munching for Frost, and it's something that you want to try and avoid as much as possible. And then the last thing to mention about Frost is they do have another passive called Icicles. You just generate one. You can see there it is. Whenever you Frostbolt or whenever you Flurry, you can just completely ignore these. They'll get fired automatically if you go over 5 or when you Ice Lance, but it doesn't matter. You just completely ignore it. Completely ignore Icicles. But the other thing that I want to mention is kind of a base thing. This is all casters, not really Frost, but a very common saying is to say, remember your ABCs, which is just always be casting. It's always better to be casting Frostbolt and have a chance to generate a proc, like here, my Flurry, and then use that Flurry to send my Ice Lances, as opposed to if I have to move, running and using unpowered Ice Lance. This is doing very little damage. So you'd rather just use your blinks and keep casting Frostbolt and try to, stay still and kind of turret as much as possible on the boss. And then I want to give you kind of an extended gameplay section so that you have something to refer to on what single target actually looks like for Frost Mage. So that's what this is going to be. It's going to be me hitting this target dummy for about a minute. When talking about covenants, Frost has 2 main covenants that they're going to choose. You're going to want to hopefully have Night Fae leveled for Mythic Plus, and you're also going to want to have Necrolord level for Raid. Necrolord is also a pretty viable option in Mythic Plus as well. This might depend on what legendary choice that you're going to want to play, so you can decide that after watching the legendary section. To quickly explain the benefits of playing Night Fae versus playing Necrolord, there's kind of a set one for each of the different builds, but I'll still give you a rundown. Night Fae has generally more AoE damage. They also have a lot more utility because they have a cheat death here, and they also have access to either 2 finesse conduits or 2 endurance conduits as well, in addition to their 3 potencies, which makes them a very strong utility option. So that is one reason that a lot of people play Night Fae in keys. Their ability is quite strong in AoE, so feels good. Necrolord, however, is the best single target option that you can play for Frost while still doing good AoE, and in some of the cases of the legendaries, it's what makes those legendaries viable in keys and in AoE. I'll mention which soulbind you're going to want to play when I'm talking about the legendary combinations, but to quickly go over the conduits that Frost has to offer, the 3 main potency conduits that you're going to want to have as your quote-unquote default is Icy Propulsion, Ice Bite, and Unrelenting Cold. You will only change these if a legendary or talent combination that I suggest tells you to. These are otherwise your 3 default ones, and you should always assume someone is writing them. Aside from that, your best endurance conduit is going to be Condensed Stamina Sphere. Your second best one is generally Tempest Barrier. That's going to give you more healing than the other ones. Your best finesse conduit is going to be Flow of Time, reduces your blink cooldown. And then another one that it's pretty common to slot in is Grounding Surge for reduced interrupt. If you find yourself interrupting a lot, this is pretty valuable. If not, you can put in this Incantation of Swiftness, where invisibility makes you run giga fast, like this. Woo! I'm zooming. Similar to the conduits that I just described for you, these are going to be your default talents. These are just the best single target talents as a default build, and if you are to change them, I will let you know in what situations and why later on. The only thing of importance to mention here is this row. This is the one where you're actually have variants. In single target, you're going to actually play Comet Storm in all situations if it's a pure single target fight. So that would be something in this raid tier like Skolex, like Calandris. A lot of people on normal and heroic jailer are also playing Comet Storm, so something to keep in mind. And the way you use this is you Frostbolt into Flurry. I'll have a section right now about it though. So to use Comet Storm in single target, once you get a Brain Freeze proc, which you're going to hold it for, you Frostbolt into Flurry, use Comet Storm, and then shoot 2 Ice Lances. And you will want to hold your talented Comet Storm until you get a Flurry. You don't hold Flurry for your Comet Storm, you hold your Comet Storm until you get a Flurry, and then you Frostbolt into Flurry, Comet Storm, 2 Ice Lances. Back to talking about talents. So Comet Storm is what you're going to play in pure single target raid fights. Splay Nice is going to be your default pick for Mythic Plus, unless you're told otherwise for like a legendary combination or whatnot. And this is also going to be your pick in, multiple target cleave and raid. So fights like Dossigne, Prototype Pantheon, things like that. And then the other option is going to be Freezing Rain. And this is going to be viable in kind of specific niche scenarios in Mythic Plus. I wouldn't recommend even looking at it all unless you're planning to do like a 19 or above key this season. And then you would run it in, Halls, you'd run it in Necrotic Wake. And that's generally going to be where you're going to run it, most of the people. And also the other side. This will be dependent a little bit on your legendary choice as well, which I will mention when we get to that section. Frost-based AoE is simple. When you're starting a pack on a pole, you're going to want to use Blizzard, Frozen Orb, and then Icy Veins, and then you fill empty space with Frostbolt. And your main goal in AoE is to make sure you cast Rune of Power on cooldown, you're casting Frozen Orb on cooldown, and you're casting Blizzard on cooldown. So to give you an example of what that looks like, you Blizzard, Frozen Orb, Icy Veins, use your 1 phase Frost proc, and now I just do my single target rotation in between keeping Blizzard up. What I would suggest is keeping Blizzard up on 3 or more targets. You can see Blizzard, then I Rune Power, use my 2 Ice Lances. If you're supposed to use Blizzard on a different target count than 3 or more targets, I will let you know in the Legendaries section. You can see Frost Mage AoE is pretty simple. My Frozen Orb is back up, so I just send it out again. One thing that's important to note in AoE is the importance of Frost Nova. So we mentioned before, Shatter is the main mechanic of Frost, the main passive. What Frost Nova does is it freezes all nearby enemies. This typically gets broken pretty fast in a group scenario, but it will still capture a few hits of your Blizzard and a few hits of your Frozen Orb. And it interacts as well with your Conduit that you have socketed, your Ice Propulsion, where crits reduce the cooldown. So obviously, a Shatter target you have a much higher chance to crit against them. And so using Frost Nova and AoE, I would generally suggest that 5 or more targets. You just want to use it when you have both Frozen Orb and Blizzard down on the target. So it look like this, you Blizzard, Frozen Orb, and then you Frost Nova. You can see they're shattered, and I just did a lot of crits. You can see if I look here, my crit rate's going down, but it was about 60%. Just from that one Frost Nova. So that is something that you can do to help reduce your Icy Veins duration or cooldown when you're inside of it. And I would, again, recommend that at 5+ targets is when you would start doing it. Before I get into each individual legendary combination, I wanted to say something about all of them combined. Deciding which legendary you're going to run. Yes, there's some legendaries that are better for some dungeons and better at a higher key level. For Frost, there is a lot of personal preference that you're going to find and comp difference for these different legendaries. The first legendary I'm going to suggest is going to be the default one that you should run if you're unsure what you should play, if you're just starting out with the class. And also, it's just a good all-rounder that you can run the entire time you play Frost Mage and still perform to almost the maximum potential that you could have, because it's just that powerful. And like I said, in general, Frost Mage legendary combinations are mostly going to come down to personal preference. There's definitely dungeons where there are standout combinations, but you can perform very well with any of these in almost any dungeon. The first legendary combination we are going to be talking about is Freezing Winds. Note, I'm not going to be talking about how to acquire these legendaries, though if you do have questions about that, I suppose you can leave a comment in the YouTube video. What this does is just when Frozen Orb's active, instead of your Fingers of Frost being RNG generated, it is now generated every 2 seconds. So this is going to be a very good default build that you can run in most Mythic Plus dungeons, and I recommend it to people who are just starting out the spec, and also to people who want like a one legendary for everything, because it's decent single target, you know, it's decent AoE, and it's very strong with Splay Nice with your default build that you have here for talents. And for Covenant choices with Freezing Winds, you can either play Night Fae or you can play Necrolord. The difference is kind of just up to you on which playstyle you prefer. Night Fae is a little more convoluted to play in AoE, but like I said, it has the utility, and it also has more AoE damage. It gives you haste in AoE as well. So I'll give you an example of the AoE rotation when running Freezing Winds. You'd also want to craft it on your head and create haste, but yeah. So same standard opener, except now I'm going to be generating Fingers of Frost more often, right? So I just want to make sure I'm spending them. I want to try not to overcap because I generate them every 2 seconds. And just keeping my Blizzard up. And now my Frozen Orb's gone, so I'm just waiting for it to come back up. And then when it does, you're back in your same rotation of trying not to overcap on Fingers of Frost procs during your orb. Here, it's coming back up. Again, try not to overcap on Fingers of Frost procs during my orb, and keeping Blizzard up. You can see I'm not spamming unempowered Ice Lances. What I'm doing is filling the empty space between my Fierce Frost procs with either Blizzard or with Frostbolt. You never want to spam unempowered Ice Lance when running this legendary. Necrolord does nothing to change your ability rotation as Freezing Winds. When Frozen Orb's out, you're still going to Ice Lance with it. So yeah, you just do this rotation, but you'd be in Deathborne if you were playing Necrolord. And I'll mention the Conduits soon. However, Night Fae does actually change your rotation when you're playing Freezing Winds. There's 2 ways that you can use this ability as Night Fae with Freezing Winds. You can either use it during orb or not during orb. If you use it, and the main goal of your Night Fae legendary, because it gives you cooldown reduction, is to get your Frozen Orb back off cooldown and get your Rune of Power back off cooldown. So with that being said, it's generally best to use with your casted Rune of Power after your Frozen Orb is done, because if you use Shifting Power during your actual Frozen Orb, you want to cancel it to make sure you're not going to overcap on Fingers of Frost procs. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So I'll use my Fingers of Frost proc, and I'll channel Shifting Power until I reach 2 Fingers of Frost procs, and then I'll just use them. And now I stand in this rune and just do a lot of damage. Pretty simple. There's also another way to use the ability, however. The second way you can use your Shifting Power is going to be after your Frozen Orb. So if you do your standard rotation, you fill your empty spaces with Frostbolt or Blizzard. Here my rune is going to end, so I'm going to cast my new rune, and then I'm going to full channel Shifting Power into another Blizzard, into doing my normal AoE rotation. And you can see my Frozen Orb is almost back up, and my Rune of Power is also only 20 seconds away. So that's why this is the better version to cast, is to use it with your casted Rune of Power. But mobs don't often live that long, so a lot of times you might want to use it inside your first Frozen Orb. When you are running Freezing Winds as Night Fae, the conduits you're going to want to take is this in all situations: single target, raid, dungeons, whatever. These are the conduits you're going to want to take in Dreamweaver. Just the potency conduits, you know, as always, the endurance and finesse conduits are a little bit up to you, but the potency conduits are the ones that are going to have the most effect on your damage, so you will want these 3 socketed. If you're playing Necrolord in Mythic Plus, this is the Soulbind and conduits that I would recommend. You're going to play Hymir, triple potency, same conduits as when you're playing Night Fae. There's a little bit of ambiguity because as Necrolord you can also slot in their Covenant specific legendary instead of Unrelenting Cold. I wouldn't recommend this as Freezing Winds generally, but you can test it for yourself and see if you'd prefer that to running Unrelenting Cold. But Unrelenting Cold should end up with more overall damage. And the last thing that I forgot to mention is there is a change to your AoE for Freezing Winds, and that is going to be that you're going to cast Blizzard on cooldown at 2 or more targets as opposed to the traditional 3 or more targets. The next legendary that I'm going to talk about is Disciplinary Command. I'll probably repeat this sentence because I'm just kind of throwing this in before my actual spiel on it, but this, I cannot stress this enough. You should kind of ignore this build unless you're planning to do a 19-20 plus keys. and kind of really push your damage. It's a lot more micromanagement, and it's not really going to shine in a low key or in a key where you're not pulling a lot of mobs. So this build has recently fallen a little bit out of favor as well, but it might see some more rise because we are still a little bit in the phase of meta adaptation. And for this, you'd want to craft it on your ring, and I would recommend crafting it critical strike and versatility. And then the next legendary I'm going to talk about is Disciplinary Command. You can read what this does, but basically if you cast a Frost, Fire, and Arcane spell within 10 seconds of each other, you get 20% increased crit chance, and that lasts for 20 seconds. So you can have a 66% uptime on this buff. The way you trigger this is, while you're casting your Frost spells normally, you trigger the Fire part using Fire Blast, and then the Arcane part can be triggered with Counterspell, it can be triggered with Arcane Explosion, it can be triggered with Shimmer. Casting Icy Veins will put down a Rune of Power automatically. That triggers the Arcane section. Casting normal Rune of Power triggers it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can trigger your Disciplinary Command. And this build is going to include some talent changes. You'll be playing Bone Chilling, and you'll also play Freezing Rain. The reason for that is these are just very strong AoE talents, and this is an AoE build. This is something I would only recommend if you're doing a 19 to 20 plus key. You know that the tank is going to be pulling a lot of mobs, and you're in a dungeon like Halls, like The Other Side, like Necrotic Wake, potentially Spires, something like that. This is where this build will really shine. It's not really going to do well in pugs. It's not going to do well in lower keys. And part of this build that you're going to want to do is macro your freeze, your pet freeze, which is an ability that you can see he just freezes off the GCD, so I can continue casting while he's doing it. And it's the same thing as your Frost Nova except range. The macro for that is just this, /cast at cursor freeze. It's that easy. You can also just drag it from your pet bar onto your normal bar if you want the targeting reticle. And so with Disciplinary Command, your opener is going to change a little bit. You're playing Freezing Rain, so it's only after you use Freezing Orb that your Blizzard does increase damage, so you don't want to start recasting your Blizzard. So instead, what you're going to do is you're going to cast Frozen Orb, then Blizzard, and Icy Veins, and then Freeze as well, and Fire Blast right after that. The reason that you're casting Fire Blast after all your other abilities is just because of your 2-set, which causes the Comet Storm to come down on the target. It could trigger off your Fire Blast, and you're going to want to pet freeze that. So if you use Fire Blast instantly, it could trigger your Comet Storm, and you might have to pet freeze your Comet Storm, but that would be much less damage because you won't be freezing your Frozen Orb Blizzard. So it'll look something like this. You see, this is my tracker. You Frozen Orb, Blizzard, Icy Veins, Fire Blast, pet freeze. There you go. That's how you do the opener. And one important thing to note with Freezing Rain, which I just kind of messed up, is you're going to want to cast your Blizzard on cooldown. And here, right, is where I would channel Shifting Power in my second rune. And my Frozen Orb almost back up. Additionally, forgot to mention this, but Disciplinary Command is only played with Night Fae. It is not played with Necrolord at all. And the main reason for that is the cooldown reduction that Night Fae provides, because Frozen Orb is pretty central to doing good AoE damage as Disciplinary Command. When you're playing Necrolord, your priority list for several spells is going to change when you're inside Deathborne. So you now will only Blizzard at 5 or more targets, and if you're running Slick Ice or Cold Front at 2 targets or more, you will ignore Ice Lance from your procs, and instead of Ice Lancing into your Flurry debuff, you will Frostbolt into it. With Freezing Winds, or just, I mean, you want to play Disciplinary Command with Necrolord, but with Freezing Winds, you would do it at 3 or more targets, and you still wouldn't ignore your Ice Lance procs during Orb. That's pretty it. It's pretty simple. I'll show you some gameplay loops of that. And on 2 or more targets, you also wouldn't ignore Ice Lances in Rune of Power, and you'll still Ice Lance when mobs are about to die or when your Deathborne is about to end. And then your Frostbolt's damage and everything is calculated when it hits the target. Your procs are calculated when it leaves your hand. So yeah, this does not mean that you get increased icicles with Necrolord. You do not triple your icicle generation. It does not increase the value of mastery because you don't get more icicles from it. So don't stack more mastery when you play Slick Ice Necrolord. Now I'm going to simulate the 3-target rotation in Deathborne, which means I will not be Ice Lancing inside Rune of Power because that is only at 2 targets. Swap targets when you get Flurry. Your Frostbolt will cleave to the other one to consume that Winter's Chill. Recast Rune of Power when it comes up. That is the rotation. You're going to want to recast Icy Veins once it runs out. The next legendary combination we're going to be talking about is Slick Ice. You can read what it does here. This is going to be your single target legendary that you're going to run in Raid. It's also pretty viable in Keys. It's very good in dungeons like Theater of Pain, Plaguefall, Mist, Spires, Tazvesh Streets as well. This is going to be a very viable option there, and Single Depths. The rotation, I mean, it's going to be it's just your standard single target rotation. Normally, your Blizzard at 3 targets or more. The only difference that you're going to find here is what I just did for your gameplay for Deathborne. That's the only difference you're going to find for Slick Ice. And then the conduits that you run is this. So you run Icy Propulsion, Ice Bite, and then the Gift of the Lich conduit as well. And you can either run Marileth or Hymir, depending on if you want more single target or AoE damage, Hymir being the AoE damage option. If possible, you want to craft this on your belt with crit haste. If you're not revered with the Enlightened, then you will have to craft your Slick Ice on the legs because you'll need your double legendary to be on the belt. You will run your standard talent for this build as well, and then your goal is to not reset Icy Veins, or not reuse Icy Veins when it's instantly up. You want to wait until it runs out, because when you reuse Icy Veins, it actually resets the stacks if you're Slick Ice. So you have to stack it up again. So you don't want to do that. And then the last legendary to talk about is going to be Cold Front. You can read what it does here. This legendary has risen a lot in popularity recently. It's only played with Necrolord, and it has the same priority list that Slick Ice has. You Blizzard at 3+ targets. Outside Deathborne, right? Inside Deathborne, you're at the previously mentioned target count. And then you ignore Ice Lance on 2+ targets, 2 or more targets, if you're casting Frostbolts or Flurries. This is also a really good all-arounder legendary. You can use it in pretty much any dungeon. It's just if you like the playstyle or not. It is quite strong of an option, varying from AoE to single target. If you're curious about the conduits, this is what you would run. You'd want to run Hymir. You'd run triple potency with Icy Propulsion, Unrelenting Cold, and then you have 2 options. You can either run Gift of the Lich, which I'd recommend if it's a Triangle week, or if you're running a really high key, so say something like a 23. Otherwise, you'd probably find more use running Shivering Core with Unrelenting Cold and Icy Propulsion. You're also going to want to get this trait because it gives you mastery when you hit an enemy over 90% HP, which is pretty valuable for Cold Front. And the main reason you're going to run Shivering Core is because this build actually does use different talents. It uses Bone Chilling and it uses Freezing Rain. You can also use Frozen Touch if you want, but that's just kind of personal preference at this moment. It's not defined. But yeah, and with Freezing Rain, you will actually cast your Blizzard in Deathborne because it's instant cast. And then Bone Chilling, you just use it, again, as mentioned before with the Disciplinary Command build, you use it with your Pet Freeze to shatter your Comet Storm. But yeah, other than that, there's nothing to say really about this build. You'll want to craft it on your back, crit haste like all your other legendaries. And I'm going to throw this in. at the very end of the video, well, close to the end of the video because I somehow forgot to mention it earlier. If you ever are finding yourself running Freezing Rain instead of Splain Ice, which again is only going to be in those 19 plus keys where you're doing a Halls, a The Other Side, or a Necrotic Wake, and again, this will be personal preference over Splain Ice. It can be better, but if you're pugging, oftentimes it might also end up being worse. But if you do find yourself running Freezing Rain, then a lot of times, given this is your standard build, right, with Icy Propulsion, Unrelenting Cold, and Ice Bite, you want to replace your Ice Bite with Shivering Core when you're running Freezing Rain. It just, Freezing Rain makes your Blizzard do a lot of damage. This makes your increase the damage of your Blizzard by a lot as well. So this is what you want to run when you're running Freezing Rain. Not this Soulbind in particular, because you will most likely be Night Fae if you're running Freezing Rain. But you do want to replace Ice Bite with Unrelenting Cold when running Freezing Rain. So, talking about the Frost Mage tier set, here's what it is. Your 2 set is going to be about an 800 DPS in single target, about 2 to 3k DPS in dungeons, and then the 4 set is going to be about 5 to 600 DPS in single target and about 1 to 1.5k DPS in dungeons. This changes literally nothing about your single target. You completely ignore your tier set in single target, you just let it do its own thing. It is going to slightly change your AoE opener, and what you're going to do is you're going to end up Blizzard, Frozen Orb, Icy Veins, and then you're going to Frost Nova. Remember we talked about earlier, Frost Nova shatters your spells. Comet Storm strikes very quickly, so when you're Frost Novaing, you are probably going to shatter 5 of your 7 Comet Storms, which is going to be really good for your Icy Veins duration, or cooldown, I should say, and also really good for your damage. So this is something that you're going to want to do, and you can reaction press it to a visual on your character. And I do have a weak aura that's going to tell you the time when it's also going to come back up. That should be linked in the description as well. So again, Blizzard, Frozen Orb, Icy Veins, and then reaction Frost Nova to when it occurs. I'll show you what that looks like. There's the proc, so I Frost Nova. Boom, I'm doing 35k DPS. So that is just how you handle the tier set. Ignoring single target, Frost Nova, and AoE. If you've been living under a rock and you don't know how to get your tier set, it can drop from any of these things that you unlock in your vault. It also is mainly just a drop from raid. So if you can get into a raid doing like, Livum, Alondris, Anduin, Raglan, or Lords of Dread, all have a chance to drop a tier set piece. And yeah, starting in 2 weeks from when this video is being posted, you can actually craft 1 set piece a week. I have no information on that. So if you're watching this, after April 19th or April 12th, actually, is I believe when it comes out, then look at Wowhead. I would say look at Wowhead. So this next section is going to be about gear. This is less going to be telling you Abyss list and more going to be telling you generally good trinkets that you can aim for as a Frost Mage, and also talking a little bit about simming, which I'm going to start off with. To actually find out what gear you want to wear, you don't want to look at anyone's stat weights, you don't want to go for those stat weights, you just want to sim your gear on raidbots.com, and generally the best way to do this is inputting your character name on there, or you can download an add-on called Simulation Craft, which makes for more accurate simming, and then you'll just sim each gear upgrade as you get it to see if it's better. The way you're going to sim is for single target, you sim 1 target, 5 minutes. If you want to look at different builds for Mythic Plus, you should sim 3 target, 5 target, and 8 target, also 5 minutes. The reason you're going to stay simming 5 minutes, even though that's not a realistic application of Mythic Plus, is because changing the sim duration will drastically affect the stat weights that you want, and also the trinkets that are going to be valuable, right? Simming it for 40 seconds with Lust is going to hugely overvalue burst trinkets as opposed to your passive trinkets. So simming for 5 minutes kind of just equalizes everything out, and it gives you an idea of what stats are going to be generally good in AoE over a long period of time, because you can't sim for downtime or anything like that. So I would recommend always simming for 5 minutes because of that. In terms of trinkets that Frost Mage uses, Frost Mage generally likes 2 passive trinkets. We're a very passive damage class. So the best ones you're going to find for dungeons are Unbound Changeling and Indivisible Ooze. From Plagueful and Mist respectively, you can get Solea's Secret Trinket technique. This is really strong. This is from Tazvesh Gambit. Aside from that, there are not really any other good trinkets from Mythic Plus. The trinkets to aim for from Raid, if you wanted ones, would be skill from actually Dasigne. He has this Resonant Reservoir. This does not sim very well, but it is very strong in AoE. This will do a lot of damage in dungeons if you use this. The other trinkets to aim for, Elegy of the Eternals is a really good stat trinket that you can just kind of pop on your character to increase your stats. The first Sigil is actually a really strong trinket, mainly for Raid, I would say, maybe a little bit less in Mythic Plus, but you might find good use out of it in Mythic Plus. This is being run by a lot of high-level Frost Mages in Raid, so that's a very strong trinket. Aside from that, there are not any other trinkets that you would really want to aim for. Again, like I said, you're going to want to sim your character to see your gear upgrades. I will say, when you're simming, you're going to notice your enchants for weapon and chest, eternal stats, and sinful revelation are going to sim higher than the ones that I have on here. That's only because they are better in single target. The only reason to ever enchant those on your gear is if you are trying to parse and raid. If you don't care completely about parsing and raid on 1 or 2 fights that are purely single target, you should run Celestial Guidance and Eternal Stats, because those are just going to be a much greater increase once another target is introduced. So in Mythic Plus, in any Cleave raid fights as well, they're just going to be vastly better than Sinful Revelation and Eternal Insight. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, you can comment them down below. Any suggestions as well.